Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
I'm going to start the screen share. And it's good to be back. So we're starting chapter 25, and we're going to be pretty much finishing up Chayyei Sarah eventually. I believe this is the last chapter of Chayyei Sarah, and let's take a look at it. Yosef Avraham, Abraham, Yosef is to add, something like that, okay, or to continue in this way. Vayikach Isha, and he acquired or he took for himself a wife, Ushma Keturah, and her name was Keturah. This is the one of the chapters that people generally don't get to read or don't know that much about. So if you're not aware of this tradition, you may find it interesting. So her name here is given as Keturah. And according to Bereshit Rabbah, Zo Hagar, it wasn't a different person. It's simply giving her a different name, Keturah. We know that people have more than one name associated with them, and sometimes it's contextual, and in this case, in some ways it is. So Keturah. And why would Hagar's name be Keturah here? V'nikret Keturah, and she is called Keturah, al shem shenaim ma'aseha kiktoret. And the reason is that her deeds were as fitting and pleasant and appropriate as incense. And incense is, when you think about it, one of the deepest emotional places has to do with our olfactory organs and how our sense of smell can affect us emotionally so tremendously. And incense is supposed to represent a deep, pleasing sense. And that's the way of describing Hagar's behavior. And it's interesting because, of course, Hagar doesn't start as being a member of the Israelite people, but is in fact an Egyptian maidservant. The fact that she's Egyptian has some literary irony attached to it. Again, as I know I keep saying this, but when you start to look at the Bible in a non-literal sense, but in a literary sense, I think jewels come out of it. So at any rate, so why? Specifically, what was it? And this is, of course, you'll see a little bit personal, but you'll see Shekashra Pitcha. And what it's saying is that she acted very, very modestly, that essentially she did not have engaged in sexual relations with anyone else, okay? Shelo nizdavga, because she did not associate Adam with anyone else, with another man, miyom shepirsha me Abraham, from the day that she left Abraham, so that she was loyal to Abraham, never wanted to have relations with any other man from that moment on. And that is given as a specific example of how careful she was in her behavior and why she'd be called Keturah.
Well, mine actually explains it differently.
Okay.
It says the reason she's called Keturah are there two reasons. One is that it related to Ketoret. The other is that Katra, it says, is the Aramaic for tide.
Yes.
And okay, you didn't explain this part.
I didn't want to be graphic. I chose not to be graphic.
Okay, but without being graphic in that way, it doesn't explain it to me very well. It says she tied her opening.
Yes, I would have said that. I chose to be euphemistic.
Okay, well, I chose to be explicit because I think it makes the connection to her name better.
By all means. Okay, all right. Yes, the word Keturah in Aramaic is the Aramaism of Katra. So that's a closer, understanding as why that specific explanation. Yeah, I was trying to be modest in my speech. But thank you, Lauren. I don't have any problem with your wanting to translate it literally.
Well, I mean, Rashi wasn't modest. If you think, I mean, to me,
Uh,
that's not necessarily modest to say
okay,
she tied her opening. I mean, immodest.
right. I understand. It's more graphic, and I was being euphemistic. And again, cultures are different, right? So saying it in Hebrew might not have the same connotations that it does. It has the same meaning. It just may not have the same connotations. But fine, as you know, we've done other things. I just chose to go that route, but I appreciate the correction if it is a correction, but also the fact that you do understand now literally the Hebrew here and its connection to the Aramaic, which I confess I didn't see right away, but it makes it more sense as to why she's called Keturah. Okay,
Why
go
isn't she part of our normal narrative?
say that again. I'm so sorry.
Why isn't she part of our narrative?
Well, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I don't remember ever hearing this discussed.
That's a good question, and I would have to say I agree with you. I guess the only possible answer I can give you, which may not be satisfying, is that there's just so much that we don't include, as you perhaps have discovered already. It's just that when we don't read the Bible ourselves, we lay ourselves open to, let's say, populistic or popularizations, I should say, and this doesn't seem part of the regular narrative. So
Well,
that's
part of
the benefit
part
of,
of
yeah, go ahead.
part of what I see is what makes the narrative is what goes into the Siddur.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that, I'm not sure that this is a Siddur issue here. I mean, there's a difference between praying and studying, although, studying is considered to be on the same level as praying. But this is informative. I see the Siddur, as engaged in praise, thanksgiving, petition, seeking forgiveness. Those are the basic modalities, and I feel that a lot of values come out of reading those things, that they're implied in
Maybe,
prayer.
maybe Judith, are you thinking of the fact that Sarah is mentioned in the Siddur and Hagar is not?
That's part of it, yes.
So where
I
is
think the idea there is that we're naming our ancestors, and Hagar is not considered to be an ancestress of the Jewish people.
and the other piece is, how often is Sarah mentioned in the traditional prayer book, on the Orthodox prayer book?
Well, in the Shemona Esrei,
Yeah, where?
Not orthodox.
Not in the Orthodox one. It's in the new, and it's the new conservative Nusach.
Yep. That's
That's
just a,
really
that's a
good.
recent thing.
Yes, it is fairly recent, and we could spend some time discussing, that particular issue. But anyway,
Miriam's mentioned more often.
yeah. Well, again, where is Miriam mentioned? Because it isn't mentioned in the Song of the Sea. It's just
Nope.
that I think Miriam was mentioned earlier, at least in terms of bringing women's names into the liturgy, was a more recent experience,
Yep.
innovation.
it is something maybe that I never realized until I got to Israel, is that Hagar is used as a name for girls in Israel. I mean, it's
Yes.
not as common as Sarah, but it's used.
Interesting. That's nice to know. Yeah. Okay. I wouldn't have been aware of it had you not just mentioned it. Should we go on?
Sure.
I'm not hearing objections, so I'm going to assume. Okay. Okay. Going on. Vateled lo, and Keturah, or Hagar, alias Keturah, bore for him et Zimran, Yokshan, ve'et Medan, ve'et Midian. So we have 4 here, et Yishbak, ve'et Shuach. So we now have 6 children. It's so interesting, of course, that at this particular age, Abraham, and he's in his hundreds here, okay, because Sarah died at 127 years, and Abraham, I think, is 10 years older than she was. So he's 137, and here he is having all these children with Hagar. And we go on with the genealogy. Yokshan yalad et Sheva et Dedan, so grandchildren. Yokshan bore Sheva and Dedan. Uvnei Dedan, and we go to the next generation. Hayu Ashurim, they were Ashurim. I'm not translating that. We'll discuss that in a little bit. Ulit Tushim Ula Umim. So they're all interesting ways of describing if they are names, if they are in fact names. And I anticipate for a moment that, and if you glance over this, you can see that Onkelos has some issues with translating these as names, but rather as descriptions.
Well, why doesn't it say Yishmael?
Okay, because Ishmael was born before. Okay, so
Before what?
Ishmael was born before this second set of children. Ishmael was, and
the fact that Hagar and Keturah are identical is a midrash. It's not explicit in the text, right?
correct. It's suggested, as Rashi tries to pull out, it's suggested by the text. It's a very ancient interpretation. And again, I go back to this position of mine that if we see this through the eyes of the rabbis, they're looking at this more from a literary point of view too. And that's why this isn't historical. This is literary. That's the main value that we're getting out of this.
What's the main difference between literary and historical?
Well, historical, I think it's a good question, Judith. Thank you. I think historical is looking for facts, although even with history, you have to sort of filter it. But I think the values, history isn't involved with foreshadowing and metaphor, and that's not historical style. Historical style is more didactic, the simple meaning and that kind of thing. I'm not saying that there isn't interpretation. Obviously there is, but it's a different approach to the information. It processes the information in a different way, whereas literary isn't as concerned of facts per se, as opposed to facts in a much broader sense, meaning living emotions. I don't think history is involved in emotional reaction, although it might be. I'm not saying it can't be used that way, but I think that when I look at literature, I think it tries to take into account the whole human reaction to reality. And that's, of course, and I'm trying to think on my feet. You asked me a great question, Judith, but that's the way I understand it. So, but things like foreshadowing, okay, are important to put into the narrative, including the meaning, and likewise, take this example that we have right here of Keturah, and Keturah being Hagar, and the reason she's called Keturah, the way Rashi is sharing with us how the rabbis look at her name. Okay, that, generally speaking, that is not the main purpose of a historical analysis. So I apologize if I'm oversimplifying.
Excuse me, Judith, I just thought of another way in which Keturah is kind of in the popular mind in Israel. There's a kibbutz named Keturah.
Okay. Well, we also, by the way, know, and again, this is more of a literary kind of way of looking at it, is the significance of Ketoret, right? So symbolism is very important, so that when we talk about hands, we're talking about control. When we're talking about legs, we're talking about movement, those kinds of things. I don't think that history, historical expression is so much involved in that kind of thing. But Ketoret, we know that Ketoret was the incense was a very powerful type of offering to be brought, and was loaded with both healing and danger, and there may be those suggestions, in calling Hagar Keturah, although here in Rashi we only have the positive meaning of it, and primarily incense is understood primarily as a positive thing, although we know that Aaron's sons died bringing strange fire, strange incense. So, I mean, all those kinds of things get bundled up as one goes through these sorts of things, and the associations one tries to discover in approaching it from a literary point of view. So so here we go, Rashi, Ashurim. So we notice it's not Haya Ashur, it's Ashurim, right? Without the Yud. So let's take a look. Uletushim, Shem Rashi Umot. So Rashi says these are the names of the heads of nations. So Litushim means the Litushites, right? Is how you might translate it, right? And the Ashurim would be the Ashurites, and that's the way Rashi would be explaining this. V'hatirgum shel Onkelos, but he says, but the translation into Aramaic of Onkelos, ein li liyashvo al lashon hamikra. Rashi says, I have difficulty understanding his interpretation based on the language of Scripture, right? Shepiresh, because he explains the Meshirin, that's the way he translates it, Lashon Machane, right? So he says, he translates, here we go, let's take a look at Onkelos here, right? Limashirian, that's how he's translating Ashurim, as camps, which is what Rashi's telling us the Aramaic means. Okay, Lashon Machane, im tomar. Okay, it says this is usually an argument. If you should say she'enochein, that it is, he can't do this. He's totally out of line, and you can't translate it that way. Mipnei ha'alef, okay, because of the Ashurim, okay. She'ena yisodit, it's not part of the root of this word. Harei lanu tevot, we have examples of words, she'ein berosham aleph, that do not take an aleph at the beginning of the word. V'hosifu aleph berosham, and yet in the scriptural narrative, it adds an aleph at the beginning, and he gives examples. Kemo chomat anach. So, for example, it means a wall that was set up with using a plumb line. And the word anach, the aleph of anach, does not belong to the root meaning of plumb line, shehu min naka, right? Because the word for plumb line is based on a word that means stricken. And I'm also, trying to think of how those are connected, and whether or not the plumb line, forces you to set the row of bricks, in a way strikes the bricks and makes sure you can make them straight by striking the bricks. Okay, so the word is naker raglayim, stricken in his legs. Ukamo asuch shemen. Okay, this was actually in last week's haftarah, and it means a cruse of oil. And the word asuch has to do, he's going to tell you, has to do with the idea of anointing. And the aleph has nothing to do with the root of the letter, shehu min verachatzta vesikita, something like that, or vesachta, probably, right? So in this case, and lischot means to bathe or to swim, right? And that's the root. There's no aleph in this root, right? That's from a verse that says, you shall wash and bathe. So uletushim, and he goes to letushim, hem ba'alei ohalim. This again is the way the Targum is understanding this, that he understands they are tent dwellers, ha mitpazrim ana va'ana, who are spread around here and there, v'nosim ish ba'uhalo, and each person travels with his tent. Let's see, apadno. So I'd have to read this, but ohole apadno. So it means his palace being his palace being a tent. So in other words, that the leaders have these fancy tents, but they are movable. V'chein hu omer, and likewise it says this is Samuel, first book of Samuel, chapter 30. Vehenam netushim al pnei kol haaretz. So here you have netushim. They're called here litushim. Rashi's going to explain the grammatical issues going on. But netushim al pnei kol haaretz means spread out over the surface of the earth. Shekain lamed v'nun mitchalfin zubazeh. Because a lamed and a nun are both dental letters. And so we've had this example, I think, before, where you can interchange letters in a word without necessarily changing its meaning. If it's the same form of letter, meaning a dental or a labial and things like that, or a guttural, etc. And likewise, a sin and a samach are sometimes interchanged because they're both S sounds, sibilants. V'chein hu omer, and likewise it states again, Samuel 1, vehinam, sorry, I must have read this. Forgive me. There we go. So we finished this, zubazo. I'm sorry, I lost the place for a second. Let's go back. Uvnei Midyan, again, we're now talking about grandchildren. The children of Midyan, the sons of Midyan, Ephah, Efer, Chanoch. Ephah, and Chanoch, Abidah, Eldaah, and Abidah and Eldaah. These are all names. Kol Ela b'nei Keturah. All these were the offspring of Keturah. So I suspect, let's just, for fun's sake, let's count the number of people here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If we're going to count these, 8. Okay, and then we've got 9, 10. Let's see, 11. Let's count 11, 12, 13, 14. Here's Yokshan, 14, 15. So we have 15 children that are descendants here.
Not including Ishmael and his.
Not including Ishmael, which would make 16. And of course, Ishmael has children too.
Is there any discussion of how maybe some of these people are female?
No, not that I'm aware of. I don't
Because, Shua, it has no descendants later.
Yeah.
And somebody else doesn't have, so I was just wondering if maybe some of these with a hey at the end were actually female.
Yeah.
And I've got some other ideas on this whole thing because it's coming up.
Okay. So I'm not aware of it. Okay. You could
Okay.
be right, but it's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
But I'd want to see some support of that. And I think you're suggesting possibly some. It would really be cool to find, an ancient interpretation that would share that with us. Okay. So you can set it out as a possible hypothesis.
There you go. Yeah.
There we go.
I got a whole hypothesis about this whole paragraph right now.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So I can stop here if you want to share that. Or do you want me to go on?
You have to finish the paragraph or it's not going to make sense.
Okay.
Okay.
So we might have time tomorrow then. Vayiten Avraham et kol asher lo liYitzchak. Abraham gave everything he had to Yitzchak, right? And let's see what it says here. Vayiten Avraham, etc. To give. Amar Rabbi Nehemiah. Okay. Birkat da'atiki natan lo. So he's saying here, Rabbi Nehemiah is saying that the blessing as a legacy, right, he gave to him, she'amar because lo hakadosh baruch hu Abraham, because the Holy One, blessed be He, had said to Abraham, v'hayei bracha. Right at the very beginning, it says, "And you shall be a blessing." Okay, you shall have the blessing. Habrachot misurot biyadecha, and as we understand this, it means blessings are transferred into your domain, your property, your hands. Levarech et mi shetirtzeh, to bless anyone you choose to bless, and assumedly God's blessings go along with that. for Avraham misaran leYitzchak, and Abraham transferred them to Isaac. Onwards, V'livnei hapilagshim asher Avraham, and to the children of the concubines which Abraham had, Natan Avraham matanot, Abraham gave gifts, Vayishalchem me'al Yitzchak bno, and he sent them away from Isaac his son, V'odenu chai, while he was still living. In other words, while Abraham was still living, Kedma, eastward, El Eretz Kedem, to the land of the east. That's where he sent them. Let's take a look here. Pilagshim, so concubines. So Rashi makes an interesting comment. He says, according to Bereshit Rabbah, Chaser Ketiv, it's written without the Yud. Our texts apparently have the Yud in it, but there must be some texts, original Torah texts, that did not have that in. So he said, and it's significant, it's interesting, right? Here we go, let's find it. Shelo haita ela pilgash or pilegesh echad. He says, because in fact there was only one concubine, he Hagar, he Keturah, because Hagar and Turah are one and the same. He didn't have more than one concubine. So again, why it's written in the plural like that is a good question. This is absolutely, contrary to the pshat, or at least what's being offered to us. My sense is when I introduce this whole thing is that the Torah is not supposed to necessarily be so accessible to the uninitiated, but you're supposed to become part of an initiated community in order to truly understand the inner meanings of the Torah. So that's the thought there. Okay. So Rashi explains the difference between a concubine and a wife. Nashim b'ktuva, that nashim are married with a ketubah, that marriage document. Pilagshim below ketubah, whereas concubines are married without a ketubah. Ka'adam rinan b'Sanhedrin daf kaf aleph, as is mentioned in the tractate Sanhedrin on page 21. Benashim ufilagshim, let's see, to David, in terms of explaining the wives and the concubines of David. Natan Avraham matanot. This is a significant Rashi. He says Abraham gave gifts. Pishu Rabutenu, that our rabbis explained, Shem Tuma Masar Lahem. He gave them names of impurity, and that really begs interpretation and explanation. I actually looked at the Torah T'mima, who's very helpful about this. Essentially, it says that Abraham knew that they would start to worship idols, that he was familiar with this. And these names of impurity are names of the idols, so as not to confuse HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, with any of these idols. So the matan, and the reason why they don't translate it as literally gifts is because it says before that that Abraham gave Isaac everything. So that's only what this is left over. So it's an interpretation. Davar acher, another interpretation. Ma shenitan lo al odot latan lo. But so it's a question of whether you put a comma in here. In other words, anything that he personally had acquired. Alodot, and this could, it doesn't say va al odot sarah. So aladot sarah usha'ar matanot. Okay, so if he received property for the sake of Sarah, so for example, when they left Egypt, usha'ar matanot shenitnu lo, okay, that any other gifts that were given to him on account of these, okay, hakol natan lahem. So here we are left with gifts gifts that he gave the children of the concubine. Shelo ratzah le'enot mehem, because he did not want to benefit. I'm going to assume mehem means from them, and I'm going to assume he means the gifts. He did not want to be dependent on the gifts of others. And with this, I'm going to stop today and just mark the page here. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording.